It is dawn in the hill country of what is now Belgium. In the winter of 54 BC, a column of nearly 7,000 Roman soldiers is filing out of a fortified camp they built with their own hands 2 weeks earlier. They are not marching out to attack anyone. They are marching out because their two commanders spent half the night arguing about whether to trust the word of a man who, just days before, had tried to take this very camp by force. By midday, almost none of these soldiers would be alive to say who was right. This is not the story most people expect when they hear the phrase, how Roman soldiers survived the winter. We tend to picture wool cloaks, hot baths, and grain stored away against the cold. And all of that is true, and all of it belongs in this story. But surviving a Roman winter was never really about clothing or food alone. It was about a system. Fortified camps, supply lines, and trust. Trust between commanders who didn't always agree with each other, and trust toward people the Roman army had only recently conquered. In this particular winter, that system didn't fail because of frost or hunger. It failed because of one lie, told at exactly the right moment. If that sounds like an exaggeration, it shouldn't, because every claim in this video is checked against Julius Caesar's own written account of what happened. The remains of Roman winter camps archaeologists have excavated across northern Europe, and letters written by actual Roman soldiers on thin wooden tablets that survived buried in the mud for nearly 2,000 years before anyone read them again. To understand how an army that knew how to survive winter could lose almost 7,000 men in a single morning, we need to go back a few months to the moment Julius Caesar made a decision that, on paper, looked completely reasonable. By the autumn of 54 BC, Julius Caesar had just returned from his second crossing to Britain, an island most Romans back home still considered to be at the edge of the known world. He came back without a finished conquest, but with something that mattered just as much to him politically: prestige. Caesar's rivals in Rome were watching his command in Gaul closely, looking for any excuse to call it finished. And in this period of Roman politics, a general's reputation was worth nearly as much as a victory on the battlefield itself. His position back home was less secure than his battlefield record might suggest. Caesar's political partnership with Pompey and Crassus, the informal arrangement historians now call the first triumvirate, had held Roman politics together for years, but it was fraying. Earlier that same year, Caesar's own daughter, Julia, who had married Pompey partly to help cement that alliance, had died. One of the personal threads holding three of the most powerful men in Rome together was now gone. A clean, uneventful winter in Gaul wasn't simply convenient for Caesar. With his political foundation already shifting underneath him, it was closer to insurance. If you're enjoying stories like this one, the kind of history that usually gets skipped over in favor of the famous battles, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of it coming. Gaul itself, the territory we now call France, Belgium, and parts of Western Germany, was conquered in the sense that mattered most to Rome on paper. Caesar had broken the major tribal confederations one by one over several years, and most of the region's leading chieftains had submitted, paid tribute, or allied with Rome simply because resistance had become too costly to sustain. So when Caesar returned from Britain, he did what a commander confident in his control would do. He called a council of Gallic leaders to a town the Romans called Samarobriva, near modern Amiens, to settle outstanding disputes and reaffirm exactly who was in charge. It was a display of order. Underneath that display, the order was thinner than it looked. several tribes were already restless. Among the Belgic peoples in the north, a Treveran leader named Atuatuca was quietly stirring resentment against Rome, testing how far he could push before anyone noticed. Submission and loyalty, it turns out, are not the same thing, and Caesar's council at Samarobriva was as much an attempt to paper over that gap as it was a genuine show of strength. The moment that gap actually tore open, though, had nothing to do with politics at all. It had to do with grain. The harvest of 54 BC had been poor across much of Gaul. Modern tree-ring record actually preserve evidence of a real drought that year, lining up closely with what Caesar himself wrote about food shortages at the time. For a Roman army, a bad harvest wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a logistical emergency. Each legion needed enormous quantities of grain to survive the winter months, when campaigning stopped and soldiers settled into what the Romans called hiberna, fortified winter camps meant to be lived in for months, not abandoned after a single night the way marching camps were. Normally, Caesar preferred to keep his legions close enough together to reinforce one another if something went wrong. But there simply wasn't enough surplus grain in any one region to feed a concentrated army through an entire winter. So Caesar made a choice that was by itself completely reasonable. He split his army into smaller groups and scattered them across a wide stretch of Belgic Gaul, placing each unit among a different tribe, so the burden of feeding Roman soldiers wouldn't crush any single people. It solved an immediate problem. It also created one that nobody fully reckoned with at the time. Every one of those smaller camps now stood alone, days from the nearest reinforcements, dependent entirely on its own walls, its own stored food, and the judgment of whichever two men happened to be giving the orders inside it. It's worth understanding briefly just how much was riding on Gaul staying quiet. This wasn't a peripheral frontier Rome could afford to lose interest in. Gaul sat between Italy and the restless Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, and Caesar's entire conquest had been sold back home as something that protected Rome itself, not just expanded it. A serious uprising here didn't just threaten one general's career. It threatened to undo years of work, converting a patchwork of independent tribes into something resembling a stable Roman province. And it risked inviting exactly the kind of cross-border chaos, Gallic rebels and Germanic raiders feeding off each other's momentum, that Roman strategy in this region was specifically designed to prevent. One of those camps was sent into the territory of a smaller tribe called the Eburones, to a place Caesar's own writings call Atuatuca. Its exact location has never been confirmed by archaeology. The best guess places it somewhere in the region of modern Belgium, in lands between the Rhine and the Meuse rivers. Command of roughly 15 cohorts, somewhere close to 7,000 men by Caesar's own count. Though ancient sources are not perfectly consistent on the exact figure, but handed to two officers, Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculius Cotta. Both men were veterans, and Sabinus in particular arrived at Atuatuca, carrying a reputation worth pausing on. 2 years earlier, in 56 BC, Caesar had sent him with 3 legions to put down a coastal rebellion in what is now Normandy, led by a chieftain named Viridovix. Badly outnumbered, Sabinus refused to leave his hilltop camp to fight, deliberately letting the Gauls believe he was simply too frightened to come out. He went further than that. He arranged for a Gallic informant to slip into the enemy camp, posing as a deserter, convincing Viridovic's coalition that the Romans were too scared to fight at all. It worked. The Gauls attacked the camp, expecting an easy victory, walked straight into Sabinus's prepared defense, and were routed. By Caesar's account, the entire rebellion in the region collapsed within days of that single battle. Hold on to that story, because it matters again very soon in a much darker way. The same officer who once won an entire campaign by feeding an enemy a convincing lie is about to be the one who believes one. Cotta, his co-commander at Atuatuca, doesn't get the same flattering backstory in Caesar's writing, but his instincts come through clearly enough in what happened next. Where Sabinus leaned toward decisive action, almost a gambler's instinct for seizing an opening, Cotta leaned toward caution. Trust the fortified position, trust the granary, and don't bet everything on the word of people you were fighting against a season ago. Neither instinct was wrong by itself. Roman military doctrine generally favored Cotta's approach, but doctrine only protects an army if the people in command actually follow it when the moment arrives. The Eburons, whose land this winter camp now occupy, were led by two co-rulers, an older chief named Cativolcus and a younger, more ambitious one named Ambiorix. Ambiorix's relationship with Rome was genuinely complicated by Caesar's own account. Ambiorix personally owed Caesar a favor from earlier dealings between them, but the Eburons were a small tribe wedged between larger, more aggressive neighbors, and several of the larger Belgic tribes, encouraged in part by that same restless Treveran leader, were already organizing a coordinated uprising against the Roman winter camps scattered across their land. Ambiorix was being pulled in two directions at once: gratitude towards Caesar on one side, survival pressure from his own people and his neighbors on the other. For Rome, the stakes of this winter were brutally simple. If even one of these scattered camps fell, it wouldn't just be a military setback. It would be proof visible to every tribe in Gaul that Roman soldiers could be beaten on their own ground, and proof like that tends to travel faster than any army can march to contain it. For Ambiorix, the stakes ran in the opposite direction but were just as severe. If he refused to join the uprising and Rome's grip on Gaul weakened anyway, his people would be remembered as the tribe that stayed loyal to the side that lost. If he joined the revolt and it failed, Caesar's retaliation would land squarely on the Eburones and no one else. Neither side, in those final weeks of autumn, understood how much of this would eventually come down to a single overnight argument inside one wooden command tent between a man famous for winning a battle with a clever lie and a man who refused to be fooled by one, because right now, none of that had happened yet. The soldiers under Sabinus and Cotta had just finished an exhausting season of marching and fighting across Gaul. What they wanted more than any glory was something far more basic: to get through the winter alive, fed, and warm. And to understand exactly how a Roman army tried to make that happen, we need to look at what surviving the winter actually meant for an ordinary soldier on Rome's northern frontier, because the real answer is stranger, more specific, and far more human than most people picture. The land around Atuatuca was hill country, broken up by forests and narrow valleys, nothing like the open plains where Roman legions' tight formations gave it the clearest advantage. It was, in other words, terrain that rewarded whoever knew it best, and that was never going to be the army that had only just arrived. Before getting into what went wrong in that terrain, though, it's worth understanding what surviving a winter actually required of a Roman soldier this far north, because the popular image, a soldier in a bronze breastplate under a Mediterranean sun, has almost nothing to do with the reality of a frontier camp in the cold. Choosing where to build a winter camp wasn't left to chance. A military surveyor called a grammaticus walked the ground ahead of the army, looking for high, defensible terrain, close to a reliable water source, exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous decision that determined whether a camp would survive the season at all. Once a site was chosen, Roman soldiers were remarkably fast at building it. A standard marching camp, the kind thrown up for a single overnight stop, could reportedly be raised in 3 to 5 hours by a trained legion, complete with a ditch, an earth rampart, and a wooden palisade. A true hiberna, a winter camp meant to last for months, took longer and was built to function almost like a small fortified town. A headquarters at its center, workshops where armorers repaired weapons and leather workers mended boots and tents, and even a small hospital for the inevitable injuries and illnesses of frontier life. At larger, more permanent forts elsewhere on Rome's northern frontier, archaeologists have even found underfloor heating systems called hypocausts built into the commanding officers' quarters. A furnace pushing hot air beneath a raised floor. Centuries before, that kind of heating was common almost anywhere else in Europe. At the center of it all sat the granary, raised up on wooden posts or stone pillars, specifically so air could circulate underneath and keep the grain away from damp ground and the rats that would otherwise ruin an entire winter's food supply in a matter of weeks. It is a small, unglamorous detail, a warehouse on stilts, but it is also a fairly accurate symbol of how seriously the Roman army took the logistics of staying alive through a season when nothing could be grown and very little could be foraged. Around that granary sat the barracks themselves, usually arranged so that roughly 8 men, a unit the Romans called a contubernium, shared a single room. One space for sleeping, a smaller adjoining space for storing gear. It was cramped. It was also, by design, a small community within the larger one. Men who cooked together, stood watch together, and depended on each other through months when there was very little else to do but wait out the cold. There was a deeper reason Rome organized its calendar this way beyond simple convenience. Campaigning in winter wasn't just logistically difficult, it was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. Roads turned to mud that swallowed wagon wheels and slowed a column to a crawl. Wet wool and wet leather meant disease spread faster through a crowded camp than any wound did. An army that tried to fight through the cold months risked losing more men to fever and frostbite than it ever would to an actual battle, which is exactly why hiberna existed in the first place, not as a retreat, but as a deliberate, disciplined pause built into the rhythm of Roman warfare. Food itself followed a deliberately boring, deliberately durable pattern. The backbone of a soldier's ration was grain, often close to 1 kilogram a day, issued unmilled so it would last longer in storage, then ground and baked into bread, or boiled into a simple porridge called pulse. On the march, that same grain became a hard biscuit called buxelatum, essentially Roman hardtack, built to survive weeks without spoiling. Wine cut with vinegar, called posca, was often safer to drink. than questionable local water, and at frontier posts further along Rome's northern border, the evidence suggests soldiers supplemented all of this with whatever the local landscape offered: salted meat, local game, even oysters and imported wine when supply lines allowed for it. None of it was glamorous. All of it was the difference between an army that could fight in the spring and one that had starved or sickened over the winter. Clothing tells an even stranger story because it runs directly against what most people assume about Roman soldiers. For centuries, Roman culture had treated trousers as something close to a mark of barbarism, a garment for the peoples north of the Alps, not for citizens of Rome. And yet, on the cold frontiers of Gaul, Germania, and Britain, Roman soldiers adopted exactly that garment. Snug-fitting trousers show up on the tombstones of auxiliary cavalrymen and eventually on legionary infantry as well, carved into monuments built decades after this story takes place. The thing Romans had once mocked as uncivilized turned out to be the thing that kept their own soldiers from losing toes to frostbite. Layered on top of that were heavy wool cloaks, the sagum favored by ordinary soldiers, and the hooded paenula, both thick enough to function almost like a portable tent in bad weather, and in some cases treated with natural lanolin, the same waterproofing oil still found in raw sheep's wool today, which helped shed rain and wet snow rather than soaking it in. Underneath, soldiers layered tunics, sometimes 2 or 3 at once, on the coldest days, the same instinct that would later have at least one emperor reportedly wearing 4 tunics under his toga just to get through a Roman winter. And then there were socks, which is where this story gets its strangest and most human piece of evidence. In 1973, an archaeologist named Robin Burley, digging at a Roman fort called Vindolanda in northern England, just south of where Hadrian's Wall would later stand, found something nobody expected to survive at all: a thin sliver of wood the size of a postcard, covered in faded ink handwriting. The waterlogged, oxygen-starved mud at the site had done something remarkable. It had preserved organic material that should have rotted away within a few years, and instead it had sat there, hidden, undisturbed, for nearly 2,000 years. Eventually, archaeologists would recover close to 2,000 of these wooden tablets at Vindolanda alone, an entire buried archive of ordinary military correspondence that nobody alive in the ancient world ever expected anyone to read again. That very first tablet was a letter to a soldier from someone back home, and the surviving fragment reads in part, "I have sent you pairs of socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants. That's it." That's the whole dramatic content of one of the most famous documents ever recovered from Roman Britain, a care package, warm socks, sent because someone who loved a soldier stationed on the freezing frontier knew that the army's official kit was not always enough to get him through the winter. Other tablets found at the same site are just as ordinary and just as human. A junior officer complaining to his commander that his men had run out of beer and asking for more to be sent. Birthday invitations exchanged between officers' wives, even a passing comment about local tribesmen the writer clearly didn't think much of. It's worth sitting with that detail for a second, because it tells you something a triumphal arch never could. The empire that conquered the Mediterranean world, that built roads still standing 2,000 years later, also had soldiers far from home in mud and fog, whose families worried whether they had warm feet. If you had to bet, Which mattered more on a frontier like this, the socks or the trousers? Drop one word in the comments. We'll come back to this kind of evidence again before the video is over. The Roman force at Atuatuca itself was a fairly standard mix for the period. Heavy infantry from the legion, organized into disciplined fighting units, supported by a contingent of Iberian cavalry from Spain, useful for scouting and for chasing down an enemy who broke and ran. Facing them, the Eburones could feel nothing resembling that kind of organized force. What they had instead was speed, intimate knowledge of every hill and tree line in their own homeland, and a willingness to fight in ways that didn't require standing toe-to-toe against a Roman shield wall. Night duty in a winter camp carried its own particular misery, one rarely captured directly in surviving accounts, but easy enough to reconstruct from the climate alone. Sentries stood their watches in the coldest hours before dawn, breath fogging in torchlight, frost forming on metal fittings cold enough to sting bare skin on contact. Officers kept guard shifts deliberately short during the harshest stretches of weather, not purely out of mercy, but because a frozen, exhausted sentry was a security risk in his own right, someone likely to miss the one signal that actually mattered. It was tedious, repetitive work, made bearable mostly by routine. And routine, as this story is about to demonstrate, is exactly what makes a camp's eventual danger so difficult to see coming. For the first 15 days at Atuatuca, none of that mattered because nothing happened. Ambiorix and Cativolcus met the Romans peacefully at the border of their territory. Grain was brought into the camp without incident. The Eburones, by every outward sign, looked docile, cooperative, even friendly. Soldiers settled into the dull, repetitive rhythm of frontier life. Equipment maintenance, watch rotations, the small comforts of a fire and a full granary, the kind of quiet that make a season feel survivable. It is exactly the kind of calm that makes an army stop watching the tree line as closely as it should. Then, on what most accounts place as the 15th day, a detachment of soldiers left camp to gather firewood, an ordinary, unremarkable task repeated in winter camps across the empire every single week. This time, they didn't come back quietly. The woodcutting party was suddenly attacked, and the survivors came sprinting back toward camp with Eburones warriors close behind them. What happened over the following hours unfolded in stages, each one feeling at the time like an isolated event rather than part of a single unraveling plan. Only looking back does the entire shape of it become visible. A failed assault, followed by a lie convincing enough to survive serious scrutiny, followed by a march that should never have happened, followed by hours of fighting that no formation, however disciplined, could have endured forever. The first attack on the camp itself failed completely. Roman cavalry rode out and scattered the Eburones horsemen attempting to support the assault, the kind of sudden, violent clash that ends almost as quickly as it starts, while the infantry inside the walls had just enough warning to man the ramparts before the main rush arrived. Soldiers who had been mending boots or grinding grain an hour earlier were suddenly standing shoulder to shoulder on a wooden rampart, shields up, watching warriors who had seemed harmless for 2 weeks come pouring out of the tree line. For a few hours, it looked like an ordinary frontier skirmish, a tribe testing Roman defenses, getting blooded for the trouble, and pulling back to lick its wounds. If that had been the end of it, this would be a forgettable footnote in Caesar's commentaries, rather than one of the most studied disasters of the entire Gallic War. What made the assault dangerous wasn't its size, it was its suddenness. There had been no warning, no obvious build-up, nothing in 2 weeks of quiet cooperation to suggest this tribe was capable of organizing a coordinated strike on a fortified position at all. Soldiers who had spent the morning on routine tasks were, within minutes, fighting for the camp's survival in full armor, javelins and arrows arcing in from a tree line that, the day before, had simply been scenery. Ambiorix had learned something important from that failed attack though, and it had nothing to do with walls. It was a lesson about leverage. He could not take this camp by force. Its ditch, its rampart, its disciplined defenders made a direct assault too costly to repeat. So instead of attacking again, he did something far more dangerous. He asked for a conversation. A messenger approached the gates requesting a parley, and Sabinus and Cotta, along with their senior officers, agreed to hear him out. There is a kind of confidence in that decision worth noticing. A Roman commander who has just survived an attack and still feels secure enough to negotiate isn't behaving recklessly by the standards of the time. It was, on its own, a fairly ordinary diplomatic step. What made this particular parley dangerous wasn't the act of listening. It was what came next. What Ambiorix told the assembled officers, according to Caesar's own account, unfolded almost like a confession. He claimed he had never wanted this war, that he had been forced into attacking the camp by pressure from his own people and from a much larger Belgic uprising he could not control on his own. Then came the detail designed to terrify rather than simply persuade. Every Roman winter camp across Gaul, he said, was under coordinated attack that very day, part of a single rebellion timed to strike everywhere at once. And worse, a large force of Germanic warriors had already crossed the Rhine, marching toward Atuatuca itself, expected to arrive within 2 days. Out of whatever debt he still felt toward Caesar personally, Ambiorix offered the Romans something that sounded, on its surface, almost generous: safe passage out of Eburones territory toward the nearest friendly Roman camp, if they would simply abandon Atuatuca before the Germans arrive. Notice the structure of what Ambiorix was offering, because it's a strategy that shows up again and again throughout military history long after this particular valley was forgotten. He didn't simply lie. He built a story with just enough true-sounding texture, a personal debt acknowledged, a believable enemy name, a tight and urgent timeline to make the lie harder to question than a simpler one would have been. A clumsy deception invites scrutiny. A detailed one, delivered by someone with a plausible reason to be honest, tends to slide past it entirely. Pause on that claim for a second, because it is worth asking the same question the Roman officers themselves had to answer that night, sitting inside a command tent lit by torches with the sound of their own wounded somewhere outside. Why would anyone believe an enemy who had tried to kill them only hours earlier? The honest, uncomfortable answer is that fear makes claims like Ambiorix's sound far more reasonable than they should. A camp that has just survived one attack is already primed to imagine a worse one coming. An enemy offering an exit rather than another fight can feel like mercy even when it's a trap, simply because the alternative, staying put and hoping reinforcements arrive in time, feels passive and exposed by comparison. Fear doesn't just distort how dangerous a threat seems. It distorts how trustworthy an escape route looks. That night, inside the command tent, Sabinus and Cotta argued, and Caesar's account preserves the shape of that argument in real detail. Cotta's position followed Roman doctrine closely. They had a fortified camp, a full granary, and friendly forces within a few days' march if they send word. Marching blind into unfamiliar territory at night on the word of a man who had attacked them days earlier wasn't caution. It was handing away every advantage they actually possessed. Sabinus argued the opposite, and his argument wasn't stupid either. If Caesar truly had already left for the winter, and if Germanic reinforcements really were 2 days out, then sitting still inside the camp meant waiting to be crushed between two enemies at once, with no relief coming in time. Better, in his view, to move now while a safe corridor was still being offered and link up with the nearest legion before that corridor closed for good. Both positions made sense in isolation. That is exactly what makes this moment so unsettling rather than simply foolish to look back on. This wasn't one commander being careless while the other one quietly knew better. It was two reasonable men working from the same uncertain information, reaching opposite conclusions about which risk was more survivable. What made it worse was the way the disagreement played out in front of everyone. This wasn't a quiet difference of opinion settled calmly between two equals. Sabinus, by Caesar's account, raised his voice deliberately, loud enough for the ordinary soldiers gathered nearby to hear him make his case directly to them rather than just to Cotta. It was a kind of pressure Cotta hadn't expected to have to argue against. Not just his co-commander's logic, but the fact that the rank and file were now listening to their own leaders disagree about whether they were about to live or die. Imagine standing in that crowd, exhausted from the day's fighting, hearing two men you're supposed to trust completely contradict each other about the single decision that determines whether you see spring. Veteran soldiers in that crowd would have understood something the newer recruits didn't, that this kind of visible split between commanders almost never ends well, regardless of which man turns out to be right. An army doesn't need its leaders to make the perfect decision. It needs them to make a decision and stand behind it together. What Atuatuca was about to prove in the worst possible way is how much damage gets done in the gap between those two things. The debate stretched on for hours. Officers and senior centurions were pulled into the argument on both sides, voices rising in a tent meant for quiet planning, until finally, close to midnight, Cotta gave way. Not because he was convinced Sabinus was right. Caesar's own account makes clear he wasn't. He gave way because the argument itself, the visible, audible division between the camp's two commanders, was starting to do its own damage. Soldiers outside the tent could hear that their leaders disagreed about whether they were about to live or die. And that kind of uncertainty spreads through an army faster than any rumor. The order finally went out. They would march at dawn. The soldiers spent what remained of that night doing something that should unsettle anyone listening to this now. They went through their own belongings by torchlight, deciding what to carry and what to abandon, packing for a journey they believed would lead them somewhere safer. At dawn, the gates opened and the column moved out. It was heavier than a column marching to fight should ever be, weighed down with baggage and personal equipment, strung out in the kind of long marching order that worked perfectly well on a familiar road and becomes a liability the instant anything goes wrong. This was not a formation built to react quickly. It was a formation built to travel. Behind the column trailed the camp's pack animals, mules loaded down with grain sacks, tools, and tents. The entire portable infrastructure of a winter camp now strung out along a single muddy track. A column built this way moves only as fast as its slowest, most heavily loaded animal, and it reacts to danger only as quickly as word can travel down a line stretching for what would have been the better part of a mile. For the first mile or so, nothing happened. And that itself was its own kind of pressure. Every step that didn't end in an ambush made the promise of safe passage feel a little more credible, which is precisely the psychological trap a column in this position falls into. The longer a danger fails to appear, the safer the entire situation starts to feel right up until the moment it doesn't. About 2 miles from the camp, the route ran straight into a long, narrow valley, the kind of terrain that, under almost any other circumstances, an experienced Roman scout would have flagged as a serious risk before committing an entire column to it. Ambiorix had already placed his warriors along both slopes above that valley the night before, waiting in the cold, betting everything on the Romans actually walking into the trap he had talked them into. There is a version of this morning where Roman scouts spot the warriors on the high ground in time, where the column halts, reforms, and fights its way clear before the trap fully closes. That version doesn't happen. The fog, the unfamiliar terrain, the sheer size and clumsiness of a baggage-heavy column, and perhaps a simple overconfidence that came from believing the danger had a known shape and a known timeline, all combined to keep the Eburones warriors hidden until it no longer mattered whether anyone spotted them. Once the bulk of the Roman column had filed into the low ground between the slopes, the Eburones attacked from both sides at once. The attack began with sound before sight. A rising wave of shouting rolling down both slopes at once, followed almost immediately by the first volleys of javelins arcing out of ground fog that moments earlier had looked like nothing more than ordinary winter mist. Pack animals screamed and bolted. Men toward the rear of the column, still unaware anything was wrong, suddenly found themselves stepping over the wounded and the dying without ever hearing an order that explained why. The Romans pulled into a defensive circle, what their own military vocabulary called an orbis, shields facing outward in every direction at once, the only formation that makes sense when an enemy surrounds you rather than facing you on a single front. Forming it under fire, with baggage animals panicking and wounded men already going down, took discipline that doesn't come naturally. It comes from years of drilling the same maneuver until soldiers can do it half asleep, which is exactly the only reason it worked at all. For a while, it held. Roman discipline was, even in the middle of a crisis like this, still Roman discipline, and a trained legion does not simply dissolve the moment it's surrounded. But Ambiorix didn't need to break that circle by force, and by this point in the morning, he had already figured out how to do it without one. He ordered his warriors to pull back whenever the Romans pushed forward, then close in again the instant the Romans stopped advancing, raining javelins and sling stones into the formation from a distance. Instead of risking a close fight, they were likely to lose against disciplined infantry. It is a frustratingly simple tactic on paper, and it is devastating in practice against a force that cannot chase its attackers without breaking its own formation to do it. By the third hour, the pattern had become almost mechanical. Advance, retreat, regroup, absorb another volley, and do it all again, with the gaps in the Roman line slowly widening as wounded men were pulled toward the center of the formation and healthy ones stretched themselves thinner to cover what was left. By the fifth hour, the cold itself had become almost as dangerous as the enemy. Soaked wool clinging to exhausted bodies, hands stiffening around shield grips that needed to be held steady for one more volley, then another, hour after hour, through the cold and the noise and the steady rattle of missiles against shields. The circle held its outward shape, while the men inside it slowly, steadily bled out. There was no single dramatic charge to brace against, no clear moment of crisis to rally around. Just the same exhausting pattern repeating itself again and again under a gray winter sky. A surge, a retreat, a pause just long enough to hope it might be over. And then another volley of stones and javelins, finding gaps in the shield wall. Whatever water and food the men had carried out that morning was already running low, with no way to resupply inside a ring of enemies who controlled every approach. Picture what that actually meant on the ground. Men standing in freezing mud for hours, shields raised against an enemy that refused to close the distance, watching the soldier beside them go down to a stone or a javelin thrown from 40 feet away, with no clear way to strike back at an enemy that simply melted backward every time they tried to. Shields, by this point, would have been splintering under the weight of repeated impacts. Arms holding those shields up since dawn would have been shaking from fatigue alone long before any wound ever touched them. From a distance, on the high ground, the circle would have looked deceptively orderly, a tight ring of metal and red cloth still holding its line against an enemy that never fully closed the distance. Up close, inside it, that order was already fraying at the edges, men shifting constantly to cover gaps left by the fallen, shields locking together a little less precisely with every passing hour. By roughly the 8th hour of fighting, the cost was visible everywhere inside that circle. Cotter had taken a wound to the face from a slingshot. The legion's senior centurion was dead. Exhaustion and accumulating casualties were doing slowly what a single direct assault never could have managed. Both men, by this point, had been fighting for the better part of a day, watching soldiers they had trained and marched with for years go down one after another with no ground gain in return. The pressure to do something, anything, other than keep absorbing the same exhausting cycle of stones and javelins must have been enormous. It is in exactly that kind of pressure, exhaustion stacked on top of fear, stacked on top of diminishing options, that a decision which looks obviously reckless in hindsight starts to feel in the moment like the only reasonable move left. And here is the moment the entire disaster turns on. Sabinus, even now, even after watching his own plan fail to deliver the safe passage he had promised, still believed there was a way out through negotiation. He sent word asking, once again, to speak with Ambiorix directly. Cotta, wounded, exhausted, and almost certainly past the point of trusting anything coming from the other side of this valley, refused to go anywhere near another parley. Sabin went anyway, taking several of his officers with him, ordered as a show of good faith to leave their weapons behind. Ambiorix kept them talking, drew the conversation out deliberately, patiently, until his own warriors had time to close in around the now unarmed Roman officers. Then it ended the way it had, in hindsight, likely been designed to end from the very first parley at the gates of Atuatuca. Sabinus and the men with him were surrounded and killed where they stood. News of what had happened would have reached the men still holding the circle within minutes, carried by whatever fragments of rumor and panic always travel fastest through a surrounded, frightened force. There was no formal chain of command left to manage that news. There was only Cotta, already wounded, and the soldiers around him fighting now without any realistic hope that this would end in anything other than what it eventually did. Back inside the circle, Cotta died fighting, still defending the formation he had wanted to handle differently from the very start of this entire crisis, right up until the moment it no longer mattered who had been right. With other commanders, what remained of the Roman force broke and tried to fight its way back toward the camp it had marched out of only that morning. Some of them made it. They barred the gates behind them, the same gates that had been opened willingly at dawn under a promise of safety, and held out as the Eburones pressed against the walls into the evening. What had begun that morning as a calculated risk, weighed carefully by two experienced commanders working from the same uncertain information, had become, by nightfall, one of the worst single-day losses Rome would suffer anywhere in Gaul. By nightfall, the survivors understood there would be no relief coming, not in time, and quite possibly not at all. Caesar's own account states plainly what happened next. Rather than be taken, the remaining soldiers killed one another inside the camp they had built only weeks before to keep them alive through the winter. It is one of the bleakest passages in the entire Gallic War, and it deserves to be treated with the weight it carries rather than turned into spectacle. These were men who had marched, built, and survived together through an entire campaigning season, and the same discipline that had held their shield wall together for 8 hours in that valley is, in its own grim way, what allowed them to face this final decision together rather than in scattered panic. There is no need and no historical basis to embellish that night with invented detail. Caesar himself never recorded. What we do know is enough. Men who had spent a campaigning season trusting each other with their lives chose, in the end, to face its final hours together rather than separately, inside the same walls they had built weeks earlier, specifically to keep themselves alive through the winter. A small number escaped through the surrounding forest in the confusion and darkness that followed, eventually reaching another Roman commander, Titus Labienus, stationed at a different winter camp some distance away. It is largely through those few survivors and through Caesar's own writing afterward that we know any of this happened at all. What they likely carried with them wasn't a clear narrative so much as fragments: the sound of the ambush beginning, the order to march out at dawn, the moment word reached the circle that Sabinus would not be coming back. Memory, under that kind of stress, rarely organizes itself into a tidy account, which is itself part of why Caesar's version, written calmly afterward with the benefit of hindsight, reads as far more orderly than the chaos it was reconstructed from. There was no independent witness on the Roman side. Everything we know about the final hours at Atuatuca passed through the memory of a handful of frightened men who made it out alive, then through the pen of a general who had every reason to frame the disaster as someone else's failure rather than his own. Modern historians estimate the losses at close to 7,000 men, nearly a quarter of every soldier Caesar commanded in Gaul that year, though, as with most ancient casualty figures, the exact number can't be confirmed beyond Caesar's own reporting. It is worth saying plainly, we are trusting the count of a man describing his own legion's destruction. It is worth pointing out briefly what didn't happen elsewhere that same winter, because the contrast says almost as much as the disaster itself. Not far away, another Roman officer, Quintus Tullius Cicero, brother of the famous orator, found his own winter camp besieged by tribes emboldened by news of Ambiorix's success. Cicero was offered something similar to what Sabinus had been offered: talk, negotiate, perhaps find a safer way out. He refused outright, held his fortified position, endured genuinely brutal losses among his own men in the process. By some accounts, 9 out of every 10 of his soldiers were wounded before it was over, and waited. Caesar, racing across Gaul, the moment word reached him, broke through to relieve Cicero's camp before it could fall. What made Cicero's choice different wasn't bravery alone. Plenty of brave men have died making the wrong call. It was the stubborn refusal to treat an enemy's offer of safety as anything other than what it almost always is in the middle of an active siege, leverage dressed up as mercy. His men paid an enormous price holding that line. They paid it inside their own walls, on their own supplies, on their own terms, rather than out in open country on someone else's. One commander trusted an enemy's offer of an exit. Another refused to leave his walls under any circumstance, no matter the cost of staying. The first decision destroyed an army. The second one, just as costly in blood, saved it when the full scale of what happened at Atuatuca reached Caesar. His own writing described pure outrage, not simply at the loss of a position, but at what that loss represented. Visible, undeniable proof to every tribe in Gaul watching that a Roman legion could be wiped out entirely. He moved immediately to request reinforcements from Rome, and according to his own account, soon commanded close to 10 legions, nearly 50,000 men, far more than the situation strictly required to punish one small tribe in one small territory. That disproportion was, in its own way, the entire point. This was never going to be a measured response, and everyone watching on every side understood that immediately. Word of the disaster didn't stay contained to one corner of Gaul for long. Within days, by Caesar's own account, news of a destroyed Roman legion was spreading among tribes who had, until that moment, been quietly weighing whether resistance was even worth attempting. A single camp's failure had effectively answered that question for several of them at once. What was left at Atuatuca itself afterward was simply silence. A camp built to last through an entire winter, its granaries still standing on its raised posts, its walls still technically intact, emptied of almost everyone who had built it in less than a single day. The battlefield went quiet. The political map of Gaul did not. Over the following year, Caesar's retaliation against the Eburones was, by his own description, deliberately total. Roman forces burned fields, seized livestock, and hunted Ambiorix's allies tribe by tribe, forcing each one to swear they would never again shelter the man who had destroyed a Roman legion. The Eburones, as a distinct people, effectively disappear from the historical record after this campaign. Ambiorix himself, according to later writers, escaped across the Rhine and vanished from history entirely. No Roman account claims to have caught him, and what became of him afterward simply isn't recorded anywhere that survives. The strategic lesson Rome took from Atuatuca outlived the battle itself by centuries, even if it was rarely stated quite this plainly. Trust the walls, trust the granary, and do not abandon a fortified position on the word of an enemy who has every reason to want you outside it. Stated like that, it sounds almost obvious, and that is exactly what makes it worth remembering. Obvious lessons are precisely the ones experienced commanders still manage to forget under enough pressure at exactly the wrong moment. a pattern that shows up again and again across military history long after Rome itself was gone. It's tempting, looking back on this story, to treat it as a tale about Gallic cunning defeating Roman strength, or simply about one bad commander ruining everything for thousands of men who trusted him. Both readings miss something more useful. The real failure at Atuatuca wasn't a failure of walls, supplies, or even courage. Every part of the system built to help Roman soldiers survive the winter, the fortified camp, the granary on its raised post, the cavalry, the discipline that held a shield wall together for 8 brutal hours, worked exactly as designed, right up until 2 commanders disagreed about something no war could ever settle: who deserves to be believed and when. That is a far less comfortable lesson than blaming one man's recklessness or one enemy's cunning, because it doesn't offer a villain you can simply remove from the story and feel safe again. Systems built by careful, competent people still depend, in the end, on the judgment of whoever happens to be standing in the room when the hardest call has to be made. So who do you think bears more responsibility here? Sabinus, who trusted too quickly, or Cotta, who disagreed but didn't fight hard enough to stop it? Type one name in the comment. People have been arguing about this one for 2,000 years. You're allowed to weigh in too. Centuries later, the wooden walls of Atuatuca are gone, dissolved back into a landscape that has long since forgotten exactly where they stood. Around that same general period of Roman history, in a fort called Vindolanda, hundreds of miles away, other Roman soldiers were writing far smaller, far gentler letters about socks, about sandals, about missing home. Both kinds of evidence, the silence of a vanished battlefield and the small human voice of a soldier asking for warm feet, survive for the same accidental reason: soil that happened to preserve what it swallowed. Neither one was ever meant to be read 2,000 years later. Both still are. It is worth remembering that neither piece of evidence was dramatic by ancient standards. No one at the time thought a soldier's request for socks or the location of a destroyed camp was worth recording for posterity. History, it turns out, often survived by accident, preserved not because anyone judged it important at the time, but because the right kind of mud happened to be sitting underneath it. That fog-covered column we opened this video with, marching out of a camp it should never have left, wasn't really about a single bad decision on a single morning. It was the moment an entire system built around trust, supply, and discipline ran into the one thing it had never been designed to survive: a lie delivered at precisely the moment fear made it sound reasonable. If this story helped you see Roman history a little more clearly, beyond the armor and the famous names, a like genuinely helps this channel keep telling the battles and empires most people never hear about. And if you want more of these, the decisions, the mistakes, and the system behind history's turning points, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.